Hello, my name is Chelsea, and I'm 24 years old. I've been coping with this problem for about a year, and it's growing worse every day. So, we recruited Dan around a year ago, and something about him seemed wrong from the start. Like, seriously off. He's 27 and appears average on paper, but the way he acts around women is bizarre. And frankly, it's starting to irritate me. We all tried to be welcome to him during his first few weeks here, because that's what you do when someone new arrives. Right, me and the other gals. Megan is 2 desks away from me, and Sarah is in the cubicle behind me. We all made an attempt to involve him in chats, inviting him to lunch, asking about his weekend plans, and other typical business activities. But this guy would give us these little responses and then walk away or return to his computer as if we weren't even present. We assumed he was just shy or apprehensive about his new work, but it quickly became evident that this was not the case. What truly bothered me was how he shut off talks anytime any of us women tried to talk to him about anything other than business. I'd ask him if he had any fun weekend plans, and he'd just answer, "Not really," before immediately starting typing or looking at papers or anything. But then I noticed him talking to the guys about sports movies or whatever for approximately 20 minutes at a time. It was so clear and honestly disrespectful. The breaking point for me came when I invited him to join our lunch group one day. We always go to this tiny eatery down the block, and it's typically quite enjoyable. And he just said, "Thanks, but I have other plans," without even looking up from his desk. But then later that day, I noticed him smiling and joking around with Jake and Marcus from accounting, as if they were best friends or something. It was as if he had changed completely. Between you and me, it rapidly became personal. I mean, I'm usually fairly friendly with people, and I've never had someone completely disregard me like that. Megan noticed it as well, and Sarah was becoming upset since she tried to start a conversation with him several times, and he'd simply give her one-word responses before walking away. We kept talking about it since it was so odd. What made it even stranger was seeing him with the male coworkers. He'd join in on their strange discussions, laugh at their jokes, and even play a small work fantasy football game. But with us, nothing. There was nothing beyond good morning and good evening, and even those felt forced and artificial. For a while, I attempted to give him the benefit of the doubt, supposing that he was simply awkward around ladies or that he suffered from social anxiety. But as I saw him connect with everyone else, it became clear that he was making a purposeful choice. He chose not to be nice with the ladies in the office while remaining completely normal and social with the men. Sarah was the first to express what we were all thinking. His behavior was creating a strange, unpleasant environment in which the ladies felt excluded and undesired. Why should we have to walk on eggshells around this individual when he is clearly capable of normal human interactions? It just didn't make sense, and it was getting under my skin in unexpected ways. The more we discussed it, the more frustrated we all grew. We were attempting to be nice and inclusive, and this guy just shut us down at every point while hanging out with all the men. It seemed incorrect and unfair, and honestly, it was starting to affect how I felt about going to work every day. Something had to give, and I was tired of pretending that his behavior was okay when it clearly was not. After that, I began paying much closer attention to Dan's tendencies, and what I learned just made matters worse. I'm not typically the kind to study someone's every move, but his conduct was so blatantly disturbing that I felt compelled to figure out what was going on. And believe me, when I started looking deeper, the proof was everywhere. Every morning, Dan would go and greet the whole room and then strike up a conversation with whoever was present. He'd ask Jake about his weekend joke around with Marcus about a TV show they both watched, and even spend 10 or 15 minutes talking with our boss about odd topics. But whenever any of us ladies tried to join these conversations or start our own with him, he went all business and professional. It was like seeing someone flip a switch. I started keeping track of specific occurrences because I couldn't believe how obvious it was becoming. Megan once remarked that she was having car issues and was concerned about getting it fixed. Dan was physically standing there, yet he didn't provide any assistance or even acknowledge what she stated. However, later that day, when Marcus complained that his car was making strange noises, Dan spent 20 minutes giving him mechanical advice and even offered to look at it. 20 minutes for a guy you'd known for less than a year while entirely dismissing a lady requesting the same kind of assistance. The lunch situation became much more ludicrous. We would see him eating alone or occasionally joining the boys on their outings, but he never accepted any invitation from us women. Sarah invited him to join our group at least 6 times, and each time he had an explanation. But then, he'd go get coffee with the guys, or join them for after-work beverages as if it were no biggie. It was clear that he was purposefully avoiding us, and it was beginning to seem very personal and upsetting. What really struck me was how varied his entire personality appeared to be, depending on who he was speaking with. With the males, he was hilarious, comfortable, and normal. He'd crack jokes, tell anecdotes about his life, and even moan about traffic, his apartment, or whatever. But for us, it was all yes ma'am and no ma'am, with overly formal, frigid reactions that made every contact awkward and uncomfortable. Megan pointed out that he never asked us any personal questions. He'd question the guys about their hobbies, family, and weekend plans, but he never showed any interest in our lives outside of work. It seemed as if he considered us as robots who only existed during business hours, whereas the male coworkers were genuine individuals worth getting to know. The breaking point occurred during a team meeting, where everyone was required to offer something interesting about themselves. Dan's reactions to all of the guys were engaged and curious. He asked clarifying questions, drew parallels to his own experiences, and even smiled at their stories. But when it was my turn to talk about my weekend hiking trip, he merely nodded nicely and didn't say anything. Sarah experienced the same effect when she discussed her photography pastime, as Megan did when she revealed her charity work. Only courteous nods and stillness. Following that meeting, the three of us went for coffee and discussed what was going on. We all agreed that his behavior was quite strange. It was literally generating a hostile climate in which we felt excluded and unwelcome at our own workplace. Sarah stated that she had never encountered anything like it, while Megan mentioned that she was beginning to hate coming to work because she felt so weird and uncomfortable with him. I realized what disturbed me the most was how unfair the entire situation was. We were trying to be kind and inclusive and create a positive work environment for everyone, but this guy was just shutting us down while rewarding the males with his typical outgoing nature. It felt discriminating, and I was weary of pretending it didn't affect everyone. Something had to be done about Dan's behavior, and it was evident that being patient and understanding would not help. The problem with Dan went to a whole new level when I realized I needed to actually grasp what was going on, because his behavior was just too strange to ignore any longer. I mean, I'm not the type of person who obsesses about coworkers, but this was hurting my entire work experience, and I felt like I had every right to figure out what was going on. So I began paying great attention to everything he did, and what I learned was very astonishing. The first thing I did was look at his social media sites, which I believed would offer me some insight into his personality, and whether he was just antisocial in general, or whether this was exclusive to women. Turns out his Facebook and Instagram profiles revealed a completely different person, one who was gregarious and outgoing with a diverse set of pals uploading photos from parties and hangouts with men and women. So clearly, he was capable of normal social interaction with women outside of work, which made his behavior at work even more perplexing and frankly offensive. I began time my breaks and lunches to coincide with his, just to see how he interacted with various people throughout the day. What I discovered was a remarkably constant pattern in which he was warm and engaging with male coworkers, while remaining chilly and professional with all women. For example, I witnessed him spend 45 minutes assisting Jake in troubleshooting a computer issue, joking about, and remaining very relaxed throughout. But when Sarah asked him a straightforward question regarding a project they were both working on, he gave her a 2-sentence response and walked away. As I watched, I gathered more proof of what I was persuaded was discriminating behavior. I began writing things down since the pattern was so obvious and problematic. Dan would join in group discussions, but he would focus all of his comments and questions on the guys in the group. He'd volunteer to assist male coworkers with projects or problems, but never offered aid to any of the women, even when we were clearly struggling with anything. He'd chuckle at guys' jokes, but respond to similar attempts at comedy from women with polite quiet. Megan and Sarah were completely supportive when I told them what I was discovering, and they began to pay more attention as well. We understood Dan had been invited to join the men's group chat, where they discussed sports and planned after-work events. However, none of us ladies had ever been included in anything like that. He was basically building a different social circle that excluded all female employees while acting as if it were entirely normal and appropriate. The most annoying element was that no one seemed to notice or care about what was going on. The male coworkers were very satisfied with Dan since he treated them properly, and they saw no problem with his behavior. Even our supervisor didn't appear to see that Dan was constructing a two-tiered structure in which males received his friendship and social engagement, while women received only the bare minimum of professional courtesy. Sarah urged that we document specific occurrences more explicitly because what we were experiencing appeared to be against corporate policy. So we began keeping track of the dates and occasions when Dan's differentiated therapy was most noticeable. For example, when Jake had a family issue, Dan offered to cover his shift. But when Megan had a similar circumstance 2 weeks later, he said nothing and provided no assistance. Or when he brought in baked cookies to share with the guys, but did not offer them to the women in the office. I also began asking discreet questions of the male coworkers to learn about Dan's social interactions outside of work. It turns out he was perfectly normal, funny, engaging, and open to discuss personal issues and share tales from his life. Marcus noted that Dan had told them about his family hobbies and even his dating experiences. Meanwhile, none of us women knew anything about his personal life, because he refused to reveal even the most basic details to us. The evidence was mounting that Dan was intentionally treating the women in our office differently from the men, creating a toxic work climate in which we felt excluded and undervalued. I mean, we were all doing the same job and were entitled to the same basic respect and social connection. But Dan had determined that only male employees were worthy of being treated as human beings. By this point, I was persuaded that Dan's behavior constituted employment discrimination, and I was tired of simply accepting it and hoping for change. The three of us decided it was time to take action and submit a formal complaint, since what was going on wasn't fair and we shouldn't have to put up with it simply to keep our jobs. The day I decided to make the complaint with HR was one of the most empowering moments I'd had in months, since I finally felt like I was doing something about Dan's unacceptable behavior, rather than simply suffering through it every day. I'd reached my breaking point the week before, when we had this group lunch invitation issue that was so obviously prejudiced that I couldn't ignore it any longer. Jake and Marcus were preparing a luncheon to commemorate the completion of a large project, and they invited everyone in our department. When they asked Dan if he wanted to join, he immediately answered yes, and began discussing how he had been wanting to try that place for months. But when the talk got to logistics and Sarah said that she'd need to reschedule some meetings to make it work, Dan abruptly changed his tune and said he couldn't make it after all due to other commitments. It was clear that he didn't want to go if women were going to be present, and it was embarrassing for all of us. That following week, I saw Dan accept an invitation to join the guys for drinks after work, joking about how he needed to unwind after a long day. But when Megan casually said that a few of us were going to check out this new happy hour restaurant and that he should join us, he responded with a cold thanks. But I have plans without even looking up from his computer. The double standard was so obvious and disrespectful that I knew I couldn't keep pretending it was normal or acceptable behavior. So I planned a meeting with HR and invited Megan and Sarah to join me so that they could share their own experiences. I spent the night before arranging all of the documentation I had kept, specific dates and instances in which Dan's disparate treatment was most apparent, examples of how his behavior impacted our workplace, as well as evidence that he was capable of regular social interaction, but chose not to extend it to the ladies in our office. The HR meeting went just as I hoped. Lisa, the representative, took our issue seriously and asked thorough questions regarding Dan's behavior habits. She was particularly concerned when we mentioned how Dan's selective networking had created an environment in which women felt excluded and undervalued in comparison to our male colleagues. When I showed her my documentation of specific instances, she said it was obvious that we had been involved in something that needed to be examined. Lisa emphasized that what we were describing may be considered gender discrimination, and that the corporation takes developing differing treatment standards for male and female employees extremely seriously. She told us that they would conduct a thorough investigation and interview other staff to gain a comprehensive understanding of what was going on. I felt so validated hearing her acknowledge that our experiences were actual workplace problems, rather than us being excessively sensitive, as I had begun to suspect. The nicest part was when Lisa told us she'd be dealing with Dan about his behavior, and emphasizing the need of treating all employees with equal decency and respect, regardless of gender. She stated that if the inquiry supported our allegations, Dan would face sanctions and be required to adjust his behavior moving forward. Finally, someone in power was taking this matter seriously and acknowledging that what we had been dealing with was unacceptable. Following the meeting, I had a great feeling of relaxation and empowerment. For months, I'd felt upset and helpless over Dan's treatment of us. But finally, I'd taken decisive action to fix the situation. Megan and Sarah were both grateful that I had began the complaint procedure, and we all felt that speaking up was the proper thing to do, rather than suffering in quiet. I'll admit I was curious to see how Dan would respond when HR questioned him with his behavior. I figured he'd either have to apologize and start treating us with basic human decency, or he'd become defensive and show his true colors, which would only help our cause. In any case, I was convinced that the investigation would back up our allegations and force Dan to modify his discriminating behavior toward the women in our office. Everything began to go apart when HR summoned me back for what I assumed was a follow-up meeting to inform me of the repercussions Dan faced for his discriminatory actions. Instead, I entered into that conference room and was confronted with information that utterly surprised me and made me doubt everything I thought I understood about the circumstances. Lisa began the meeting by stating that they had finished their investigation and spoken with Dan about our allegations. Instead of telling me about his penalty or the behavioral changes he'd be needed to make, she began discussing his point of view on the problem and how he'd offered context for his workplace interactions. I already had a bad feeling about where this was going, but nothing could have prepared me for what she said next. Dan reportedly indicated to HR that he maintained strict professional boundaries with female coworkers as a result of an occurrence at his former employment, in which informal friendships with women in the workplace led to harassment allegations against him. He informed them that he had been unfairly accused by a female coworker who mistook their cordial exchanges for romantic desire, and that the scenario had almost lost him his career and reputation. To avoid similar misunderstandings, he now maintains a professional courtesy-only policy with female coworkers. I was completely stunned. Lisa was sitting there, telling this as if it somehow validated Dan's behavior, as if his previous experience gave him the right to treat all women in the workplace as potential dangers who lacked fundamental social skills. I tried to emphasize that whatever his motivations, his disparate treatment was still creating a toxic work environment for us. But Lisa appeared more concerned with his legal right to preserve professional boundaries than with how his actions affected the women in our department. The worst part was when she told me that other male coworkers had stepped forward to support Dan during the probe. Apparently, Jake and Marcus, as well as our supervisor, all affirmed that Dan had revealed his previous employment experience with them, and that they understood and supported his decision to maintain tight professionalism with female colleagues. I felt absolutely betrayed. I thought these guys were our friends and coworkers, but when it came down to it, they supported Dan and pretended that his discriminatory behavior was entirely fair. Then Lisa dropped the real bomb. She stated that during their investigation, several employees raised worry about how Megan and Sarah had been observing and discussing Dan's behavior. People must have spotted us studying him, timed our breaks to monitor his interactions, and continuously discussing him amongst ourselves. Some coworkers described our behavior as obsessive and uncomfortable, and a few others had complained that we were causing workplace drama and making them feel uncomfortable about their personal dealings with Dan. I couldn't believe what I heard. We had somehow gone from being discriminated against to being accused of harassing ourselves. Lisa emphasized that methodically watching a coworker's behavior, documenting their social connections, and fostering a hostile environment through continual discussion and complaint may constitute workplace harassment under corporate policy. She stated that while our feelings were justified, our reaction to the incident had crossed some boundaries and made other employees uncomfortable. Lisa told me at the end of the meeting that they were not going to take any action against Dan because while his behavior was hostile, it did not violate any business policy and was actually within his employee rights. But she insisted that Megan, Sarah, and I take required sensitivity training on appropriate workplace behavior and professional limits. She also stated that they would be monitoring the issue to ensure that there were no additional instances of harassment or aggressive conduct. I left that meeting feeling absolutely humiliated and confused. How had a circumstance in which we were plainly discriminated against, and we ended up being the ones in trouble? I still thought Dan's behavior was improper and unjust, but it appears that the corporation disagreed and saw us as the problem. It was the most irritating and invalidating job experience I'd ever had, and I had no idea how to comprehend what had transpired. The aftermath of that HR meeting was the most embarrassing and devastating period of my entire career, and I'm still trying to figure out how things went so horribly wrong when I was simply attempting to address actual workplace discrimination. What happened next was like seeing my professional life disintegrate in slow motion, and the worst part was that everyone assumed I deserved it. Within a week of our sensitivity training classes, word had traveled around the office about the study and its findings. I never discovered out who leaked the information, but everyone knew that Megan, Sarah, and I had filed harassment charges against Dan, and that HR had determined that we were the ones engaging in inappropriate behavior. The glances I started getting from coworkers were a mix of embarrassment, judgment, and occasionally downright animosity, as if I had become this toxic person who caused drama and made everyone's job more difficult. The social dynamics in our department evolved dramatically and not in our favor. People who used to involve us in lunch plans and informal talks began to avoid us, as if they were scared we would chronicle their interactions and submit complaints about them as well. Even worse, I noticed that other coworkers went out of their way to be particularly cordial and inclusive with Dan, almost as if they were emphasizing how irrational our objections had been. It was quite frustrating to see him handled as if he were a victim in need of our protection. My connection with Megan and Sarah also began to deteriorate, which was upsetting because I had believed we were all in this together. Sarah was the first to turn on me, alleging that I had coerced her into submitting the complaint and that she had never considered Dan's actions to be that troublesome. She claimed she just went along with it because she didn't want to dispute with me, but she now regretted her involvement and blamed me for the professional implications. Megan was silent for a while, but finally she began to make comments about how we could have misjudged the situation and should have simply accepted Dan's professional boundaries instead of making such a huge issue about things. The final blow came when I discovered Dan had been offered a promotion to a different department effective immediately. HR portrayed it as a lateral move that would benefit his career advancement, but it was clear that they were praising him for competently resolving our complaints while effectively removing him from our poisonous environment. Meanwhile, I had this formal reprimand on file which would damage my performance reports and future advancement possibilities. Dan received progress and approbation, whilst I was regarded as a troublemaker who couldn't handle typical professional interactions. What made matters worse was that I began to experience the same type of social isolation that I had blamed Dan of causing. Coworkers would have discussions that would end as I approached lunch invitations that inexplicably did not include me, and an overall environment of people being courteous but distant whenever they had to deal with me. The irony of being the one eating lunch alone and feeling excluded from office social dynamics was not lost on me. But unlike Dan's circumstance, mine was the direct result of my own actions and poor judgment. My work performance began to decline as a result of the overall scenario, which distracted and depressed me. Instead of focusing on my actual job obligations, I'd spend half of my day stressing over how unfairly I'd been treated and attempting to salvage my reputation. My boss began making comments about my attitude and productivity, which increased my stress and made me understand that my position at the company might not be secure in the long run. The saddest part of it all is that I still don't understand how I ended up being the villain in a circumstance where I truly believed I was addressing workplace discrimination. Dan maintains his professional boundaries with female colleagues, which presumably everyone now accepts as absolutely acceptable and proper. While I'm stuck with the reputation of causing unneeded drama and failing to handle work relationships maturely, I've effectively become a cautionary story about what happens when you misjudge workplace relationships and allow personal impulses to interfere with professional judgment, even though I still believe Dan treated us unfairly in comparison to the male colleagues. In retrospect, perhaps I could have simply understood that some individuals prefer to keep work connections completely professional, but it felt so personal and discriminating at the moment that I couldn't ignore it. Now, I have to deal with the implications of that decision every day, and I'm not sure if my career will ever recover.